Howdy, Humanities 2, Shasta College. How you doing? It is Cinco de Mayo, May 5th. Do you know what that means? Does it have any meaning to you? Why should it? You're an American. Well, we celebrate Cinco de Mayo. A lot of places do. It's essentially a revolution that happened in Mexico. They went to war for their freedom and then won May 5th. So we all celebrate it by drinking margaritas and eating enchiladas, I guess. Anyway, welcome to the class. Hope you're doing well. We only have 3 more weeks. The 20th. Okay, you know that. I'm not telling you anything new. But what I'm going to tell you new, we're going to start a new section. We're going to finish out the course on cinema. Um, we've raced through Renaissance, art, music, literature, plays, Shakespeare, Picasso, Warhol, 20th century music, 20th century art, painters rather. And now we're going to be talking playwrights. And now we are going to be talking about films, movies. Do you like movies? Do you like cinema? Fancy word for it, French. French created a lot of the terms that we use for cinema. Um, because cinema was essentially invented almost in France, although in America, early invention of the camera and the first movies to ever be made was made by, take a guess, the same gentleman who created light bulbs, created the phonograph. He's an inventor that created a lot of things that we still use to this day. Thomas Edison was inventor, gives credit for inventing movies essentially. The Lumiere brothers, which was a French pair of brothers, developed it into movie theaters and big screens where people gathered to see the movies. And so they took it a step further. The first movies ever made were made in Orange, Jersey by Edison at his laboratory. He had I'll show some documentary film clips. Please watch them. He created a studio there called the Black Maria, which was essentially about as big as two school buses, and it was a black studio, black building that he put on tracks that they can move to follow the sun. Because he even knew then that light was the key to cinema, and they didn't have enough light in those days, the actual light like light bulbs, to make cinema without using a roof that he could open and get the sun. And he made some of our first films ever in there in the Black Maria. Simple little things of people kissing, which was a big controversial thing when people saw it. People dancing. No talking yet because no sound was invented. Nobody knew how to record vocals. The very first early movies were only a few seconds long. Horses, crowds of people, trains, and the like, and people were just fascinated by it because up until then we had paintings and photographs. Now this is moving photographs, and there's a trick to it. If you look at the documentary I'll put up there, you'll see what it was, how to make those images move. And people were just fascinated by it. And they didn't even have a projector. And so they had these little machines, they called them Nickelodeons. You put a nickel in and you can watch it on this machine. Horse race, a man running, fencing, throwing a shot put, a woman dancing, and people would put in another nickel to watch it again, and then another nickel to watch it again. Well, then after a while, people thought this could take off. Maybe we should build a building and project this thing on a screen and charge a fee for people to come in and look at it. But they're not just going to want to watch a person dancing or a couple kissing. They're going to want to watch something a little more involved, a little more depth. And so they started making stories. Now, in the early cinema, the stories were really basic. I'm going to put up one of the first sci-fi movies. Look at it. One of our first movies we ever did here, which was filmed out there in New Jersey, called The Great Train Robbery. It's only 12 minutes long. Watch it. That's early storytelling. Pretty primitive, right? So effective, though, that people couldn't get enough of it. So so emerged were they in this visual images that they believed what was happening on the screen. When a train is coming towards them, meaning the audience, people would jump out of the way. They would jump out of their chairs, thinking the train is actually going to come out of the screen. That's how realistic it was to them at the time. We laugh at it now, but put yourself back there, 1901, 1902, and you're seeing that for the first time. I don't think you'd laugh. You might laugh with delight. That was a fact. So cinema started in earnest in the industrial age. Things were changing in the world. We're coming out of an egalitarian life of growing vegetables and farmers to an industrial life of making things. Railroads, the first cars were starting to be made. The first airplanes were starting to be made. Were within years of a world war, World War One. Modern technology has come a long way. Buildings are being built in New York City. Highways are being built. Not so much yet because the car wasn't there yet, but that's soon to happen. And in this midst, this very sophisticated box, this camera, showed up on the scene, and people really took to it. They started building bigger and bigger theaters. They started making more elaborate movies. Within a few years of the Great Train Robbery, they made a feature film. What does that mean? Well, that means a full length film, um, as opposed to a short, which was what most films were, 5 to 10 minutes at the most. But people could sit there if they wanted to see more. Not like we are now, where it seems like we're going back now. Now we're going from long films to TikTok videos, 15 seconds. So in a way, we're retro. We're devolving as visual viewers. That is for sure. But in the early days, people could sit. They wanted to, and they started making it an event. They started going to the movies as a something they do on a Friday or Saturday night with a friend or a couple and enjoying this. And then, so what is that? Uh, from there, we had refreshments. People wanted to have a refreshment while they watch this new phenomenon on the screen. They dressed up. Yes, in those days, they dressed up to go to the movies. It was a social event. Not every city had one of these movie theaters. When movies became more and more sophisticated, these theaters showed up everywhere. There was one in Reading called the Cascade. Now that showed up later. That was in the late early 30s. We're still now in 1904, 1905. There's no movie theaters here then. And in most cities. So somewhere along the line, some people got together and thought, we can make possibly some money off this. And so they wrote scripts like a play and started filming the scripts. And the filming was very primitive. It's before we had tricky lenses that we didn't know what a close up was. The movie was filmed like a stage play, actors on the stage, the cameras, the audience. You're kept at a distance. That was early cinema. So it looks like you're attending a play. Um, and that was fine until cinema revolutionaries who had foresight of learning how to take this technology and how to tell a story with it started coming up with things like a moving camera, meaning they put it on a set of tracks and they can move it. So it's always just not a static shot. They learned how to develop a lens. You can do a close up, and all of a sudden now we can see the faces of these performers. We didn't know who actors were for many years, first early years, because we only saw them from a distance. They weren't recognizable, and yet there was people making their living in cinema early on. Then, but we didn't have the cult of celebrity like we do now. But that all changed with close up because now we could recognize them. Now, these people, these actors, thespians, could be seen what they really look like. And so now the cult of celebrity starts. And they could be seen if they went out. If they're out to dinner somewhere, taking a walk somewhere. People might recognize them because they saw them in a film. One of the earliest films that you could see something like this in uh, was called Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. Came out in 1915, and it changed everything. He utilized the camera like nobody had ever seen before. He told a very complicated story during the Civil War of a slave uprising. It has been deemed a racist film because it is, folks. But at the time, people took it as real. And the story goes that the slaves escape and they wreak havoc on the town. They want to rob everybody. They want to rape the white women, supposedly, and take over everything in the very primitive way that slaves had. Most of the slaves in the movie, by the way, were played by white people painted black. Um, that's not just the racist part of it because that was common in those days. Blackface, they called it. But what was the racist aspect of the film is they don't show any African American slaves behaving in a white way. They are behaving like criminals. And who comes to save the day? Not the army, not the police, but the Ku Klux Klan. That's right. And they have an army of guys on horseback and they're white sheets, and they come into the town to save the white people from these horrible, horrible black slaves. And they are the heroes of the movie. Well, that movie was so popular that Woodrow Wilson, who was our president at the time, loved that movie and he played it at the White House quite a bit. People came over. It was a hit movie, meaning they were making money off this movie until two things happened that kind of put a backlash on it. One was, up until then, the Ku Klux Klan was a very small, antiquated club, racist club in the South predominantly. Well, after this movie came out, their ranks swelled to 150,000 members, and they marched on Washington, D.C. After that movie. They were so excited about the movie because they consider themselves patriots that people joined the Klan to do the right thing, to keep these black people in check. And for a while there, the KKK was one of the biggest private organizations in the United States of America. Okay, that's one sidebar note that happened there because of that movie. The other one was some African American writers who wrote for black papers. Yes, they had black papers and white papers in those days, folks, and never the two shall meet. In big cities like Philadelphia and Detroit and Chicago, started writing reviews about the movie, saying how racist it is. Look at the content. Look what you're trying to promote here, and how bad it is. Well, then that's when people looked at the movie in a different light. And over the years, D.W. Griffith was accused of being a racist. He said he was only depicting what he grew up with in the South, which is probably right, but still no excuse. And he continued to make films. And made another film right after that one called Intolerance. If you can see the irony in that, folks, because he was intolerant of black people. But this movie, they're really extraordinary to watch, and you can watch them on YouTube. Um, Intolerance, he covers the whole mankind. He starts with the birth of Jesus, goes, but before that, he's in the caveman days. There are actually dinosaurs in this movie. Cavemen and dinosaurs did not exist together, folks. Um, and then we have the religious aspect of it, of the birth of Jesus. And then we have Holy Roman Empire in this thing. This movie has it all. And it goes up to modern times, which would be right at the break of World War One. Big epic that he spent a lot of money on. They had thousands of extras. It's really incredible film to watch, the scope of it. In silence, nobody's speaking. We still don't have the technology to tape record. There's no such thing as a tape recorder or microphones to tape people speaking, but they weren't silent films because there was usually an orchestra. There was usually, and a lot of these films had sound effects that were played during the movie, not on the soundtrack of the movie. There's no soundtrack, folks, but actually live in the theater. And in small theaters, there might be a lone piano person playing the score. And they might even provide the sound effects, let's say, of gunshots, horses running, whatever sound effect they could come with, thunder, not lightning, of course. Um, that was popular. And so they aren't silent films. They're just have no speaking dialogue. They have subtitles. People are moving their mouths and they are saying dialogue, and you'll see it written, but not like subtitles in a foreign movie. They called them title cards in those days. They would talk, and then you'd see a screener go black, and then there'd be a title card of what they said, supposedly. A lot of times the lips aren't mentioning what they're saying, but that's okay. They're getting the story across visually. So, film, cinema was a visual medium in the beginning until sound came in 1927. I don't want to go too deep today because we're for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be in movies. But when sound came in 1927, the earth shook and the revolution was on. But before then, cinema was very successful. We had movie stars, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks Sr., the comedians, Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, Charlie Chaplin, probably the most famous early cinema comedian all time, and their movies did box office gold, and all through silent films. I'm going to ask you to watch a silent film, maybe write about it. Possibly, we'll see. But look at the documentary I'm going to post, and when I meet you next, we're going to come talk about each decade of cinema. Right now, we're up into, let's just say, we're coming out of World War One. Women are getting the right to vote. And remember, I'm always trying to connect what's going on with the culture, what's going on in the arts. So, what's going on in the arts when women get the right to vote? Well, a lot. What's going on in the culture? We've already covered this. Prohibition. Prohibition means no liquor, but people were having the best times of their lives. They came out of World War One. We survived it, and we wanted a party like there's no tomorrow. And so these things called speakeasies started cropping up everywhere. There are private clubs, and you could drink illegal liquor at these clubs, and everybody did it. Politicians did it, movie stars did it, regular people did it. It just wasn't for local sleazy drug lords, drug addicts, or something, because they weren't going to stop people from drinking. Women got the right to vote in 1919, and they cut their hair. Victoria era was over, meaning the corsets and the way they dressed was over. Women became more free. They actually called a lot of these women who went out and danced with these short haircuts, they called them flappers. These are single women. These aren't married, stay-at-home women. They're having a good time, and they were smoking cigarettes and having a good time right alongside the men. And it was called the Roaring Twenties, and it went for a whole decade. The party was on. Silent films were happening. People were going to the movies. We'd survived World War One, but there was still a lot of horrible stuff in the country, like Jim Crow. African Americans still were under the thumb of this antiquated law called Jim Crow, which is a vaudeville term, but essentially meant that bath in the South, especially, bathrooms are separated: black bathrooms, white bathrooms, restaurants, hotels, all had separate entrances, separate areas of the town. You couldn't sit on the same side of the bus, front or back of the bus, blacks in the back, of course. That all changed later on as civil rights started creeping into everything, but that's not happening yet. In Jim Crow, you could legally lynch somebody for simply speaking to a white woman. A black man speaking to a white woman was a lynchable offense, or looking at a white woman. Think about that one, folks. Now, this isn't everywhere, but it's predominantly in the South. And Jim Crow lasted until the 1970s. That's right. Um, it was there. We still have signs of it, right? What are the signs of Jim Crow still? Did you ever read the newspapers? Did you look in the news? White police killing black people over traffic offenses. That's Jim Crow, folks. And that needs to be talked about in this class, needs to be talked about in our art and the cinema, because that's what goes on in the culture. But 1920s, the culture was busting at the seams. But during the 20s, because of illegal booze and prohibition, gangsters for first time showed up. Gangsters who were dealing with illegal liquors. And all of a sudden we had gangs in Chicago, New York, gangsterism. In the 30s, we started making gangster films because we make our films to reflect what's going on in the culture. And on that happy note, watch a movie. Check this out on modules. Keep up with the good papers. I'm going to give you guys a test next week, not tonight. So you're free of that. Why don't you start a discussion? What's your favorite movie? Why? and try to explain it why. Don't just say you like it because you like it. Why do you like it? We all have favorites. You can have several favorites. It's great. Nobody can have one. Anyway, welcome to cinema as we wind our way down through the history of humanities and how it relates to our culture of our times. See you next time.